Mr. Emeka, a wealthy widower in his 50s, lost his wife 4 years ago and now lives with his daughter Gozi and his son Ibrahim. During his frequent boat rides on the Lagos Lagoon, he often encountered Mrs. Fatima and decided to marry her daughter Amina. Mrs. Fatima lives with her daughters in a small house along the shores of Lekki Beach. The family is known as the Kofi Bey household, a name that comes from Mrs. Fatima's late husband, Mr. Kofi, who passed away years ago. Mrs. Fatima had married Mr. Kofi when she was 18, but she never found the excitement she was seeking in the marriage. Just 2 weeks after their wedding, she resumed her boat trips. Mr. Kofi could never complain about his wife's freedom. During her boat rides, even when her husband was present, Mrs. Fatima had no problem receiving letters and flowers from other men. She gave birth to 2 daughters, Adawale and Amina. For Mrs. Fatima, her children were reminders of aging and obstacles to her freedom and enjoyment. Once her children grew older, Mrs. Fatima resumed her outings and parties. Unable to tolerate her carefree behavior anymore, Mr. Kofi one day sneaked into her room and ransacked her drawers and closets. Eventually, he found her love letters. Unable to bear the disgrace, he died a week later from heartbreak. Mrs. Fatima was saddened by his death, and though she felt some guilt for having caused it, this remorse didn't last long. A month later, she was back enjoying outings and social gatherings. Mrs. Fatima is now 45 years old and has been one of the most recognized faces in Lagos social scene for 30 years. She tries to hide her white hair by frequently dyeing it blonde. She pays little attention to what people say about her, living by the motto, "Oh, if you listen to people, you won't be able to do anything. One should live for oneself, not for others." Mrs. Fatima's eldest daughter, Adawale, married Babajide, despite her mother's fierce opposition. Adul's pregnancy, which followed soon after, devastated Mrs. Fatima, as it meant not only that her daughter was becoming a mother, but also that she herself was officially entering the realm of grandmotherhood, a stark reminder of her aging. One day, Mrs. Fatima took her daughters for a boat ride. During their outing, they passed Mr. Emeka in his boat. He had just visited Mrs. Fatima's house to propose to Amina. Mrs. Fatima thought Mr. Emeka was looking at her, but in reality, his gaze was fixed on Amina. When they returned home, Mr. Babajide excitedly delivered the news that Mr. Emeka had come to ask for Amina's hand in marriage. Mrs. Fatima, furious that Mr. Emeka, someone her age, would prefer her young daughter to herself, became jealous. Amina, however, was thrilled by the proposal. Although Mrs. Fatima objected to the marriage due to Mr. Emeka's age and the fact that he had 2 children, Amina did not see these as obstacles. What excited Amina most was Mr. Emeka's wealth. After a long and heated argument, Amina managed to convince her mother to agree to the marriage. Mr. Emeka was one of those men for whom age didn't matter at all. And the children? Amina actually found that appealing. "They'll call me mother, won't they?" A young mother at 22, especially the boy, with his chubby eyes staring at me like that. Marrying Mr. Emeka meant living in one of the grandest mansions on the Lagos Lagoon, where chandeliers hung from the windows, heavy curtains adorned the rooms, and ornate Louis XV walnut chairs, gilded tables, and lamps covered in thick fabric graced the halls. As Amina imagined this mansion, her mind filled with dreams of silks, lace, colors, jewels, and pearls. Everything she had longed for but never had was finally within her reach, and it brought tears of joy to her eyes. Yes, she thought, come to me, grand mansions, white boats, mahogany boats, cars, fabrics, jewels, all the beautiful things, all the bright dreams. You, all of you come to me. After informing Mrs. Fatima of his intentions, Mr. Emeka returned to his mansion. He sat in his study, thinking about how to tell his sensitive daughter, Gozi, that a new woman was coming to take her mother's place. Mr. Emeka had married when he was 30, and for 16 years, he had tirelessly cared for his wife through her various illnesses, yet he had been unable to prevent her death. He had lost his wife 4 years ago. Since then, Gozi had struggled to recover from the shock, falling ill and suffering from nightmares. Mr. Emeka had been deeply attentive to her, and as a result, her attachment to her father had only grown stronger. Mr. Emeka now felt unable to tell her about his upcoming marriage to Amina, so he sought help from Kioma, their governess. Gozi learned about her father's plan to marry a young woman from Kioma. That night, during dinner, she could hardly eat, and soon she broke down in tears. The next morning, she went to her father and wrapped her arms around him. "Father, you'll still love me, won't you? Just as much as you do now?" she asked. When her father reassured her, she responded, "Then it's fine, let her come." Kioma had come to Mr. Emeka's mansion when Gozi was just 4 years old. Her father had lost his entire fortune in horse racing before taking his own life. After his death, Kioma chose to live a modest life with relatives rather than become a fallen woman in Paris. To earn her place in the household, she voluntarily took on the education and care of the children. After a falling out in France, she left and came to Lagos, where she served as a governess for a prominent family. After working there for a while, she joined Mr. Emeka's household. Gozi was only 4 at the time, and 2 years later, Ibrahim was born. After Ibrahim's birth, Mr. Emeka's wife's health declined, and she passed away 2 years later. Before she died, she asked Kioma to be more than just a governess and to care for her children like a mother. Kioma, proud and principled, grew more attached to the household, especially since Mr. Emeka always treated her with respect and kindness. Chinedu, Mr. Emeka's nephew, attended King's College Lagos because his father had been assigned to a different city for work. Chinedu visited his uncle's mansion once a week. At 20, Chinedu was a reckless and carefree young man, known for his relationships with numerous women. Chinedu was one of those young men who, by the age of 20, believed they had already learned all that life had to offer. He faced the world with none of the hesitation of a novice stepping onto the stage for the first time. For him, life was like a comedy, fully learned in school. Life for him was one long entertainment. However, his concept of enjoyment had evolved. He didn't truly find joy in anything. He rushed from one amusement to the next, always seeking laughter but never truly entertained. Behind all his smiles and laughter, there was an underlying restlessness, constantly pushing him from one pleasure to the next. One night, he could be seen enjoying an opera at Musen Center. The next day, he might be wandering the gardens of Victoria Island. On a Sunday, he would take a singer by car to Lekki. There was not a single place in Lagos where Chinedu had not sought a brief moment of pleasure. There was an 8-year age difference between Chinedu and Gozi. Chinedu saw himself as an older brother to her, always teasing and provoking her. Their playful bickering was constant. One day, Kioma took the children, Gozi and Ibrahim, to visit their aunt on Victoria Island for a 2-week stay. Gozi, realizing that Amina was going to take her mother's place, began to distance herself from her father, fearing that he would no longer love her the same way. During this time, Gozi was also transitioning into young womanhood. She became more irritable, often getting upset over trivial matters, and would sometimes withdraw, seeking solitude. A small ceremony was held to celebrate her transition into womanhood, complete with new dresses and linens. A year had passed since Mr. Emeka's marriage to Amina. One day, both families, Mr. Emeka's and Mrs. Fathima's, decided to go on a picnic to Acacia Forest Reserve. Chinedu took a particular interest in Adewale, spending hours trying to charm her. As Adewale attended to her son Faridun, Chinedu kissed her neck. Adewale, unable to bear his advances any longer, resisted. When Chinedu looked around, his eyes met Amina's. Later, Chinedu approached Mrs. Fathima and, in his typical fashion, regaled her with stories of his romantic escapades, even flirting with her. He never tired of following both Adewale and Mrs. Fathima around. The romantic tension between Chinedu, Adewale, and Mrs. Fathima stirred something in Amina. That evening, after the picnic, Amina retreated to her room, claiming to be tired. As she sat in the darkness, a deep sense of loneliness washed over her. She felt as though there was a fire burning deep within her soul. Slowly, she undressed, longing to feel the cool night air against her skin. Amina felt a burning fire inside, even as the cool night breeze brushed against her. If only she could be in the water, in the sea. The wind kept blowing against her shoulders, caressing her chest, as if it were kissing her with cold lips. The more the wind kissed her, the more she wanted to expose herself, to feel more of its kisses. At that moment, Mr. Emeka entered the room and was surprised to find his wife standing naked by the window. He moved to kiss her, but Amina felt a strange coldness towards him. She told him she wanted to be alone and asked him to leave. That night, Amina reflected on their 1 year of marriage. She had given her youth and her body to this old man, but she had never given him her heart. When she thought of her husband, it was as if her soul froze. While she had gained the material wealth she had always dreamed of, her heart remained poor, deprived of love, passion, and excitement. As Amina lay in her bed, memories of Chinedu's flirtations with Adewale and Mrs. Fatima came to her mind. She saw him kissing the back of Adul's neck with burning lips, and later saw his mischievous gaze as he rocked Mrs. Fatima in the hammock Amina wanted to love. It was the one thing missing from her life, and without it, nothing else mattered. She longed to love passionately, to be consumed by love. Yet here she was, buried alive in this grand room filled with wealth, as though she were entombed in black marble. She could hardly breathe. She was suffocating. She wanted to escape this tomb, to live, to love. Tired of the darkness, Amina lit a candle, casting a soft yellow light across the room. She saw her naked body in the mirror and marveled at her beauty. But the thought of this beautiful body decaying without ever knowing love or excitement filled her with sorrow. She smiled at herself, a bitter smile, laughing at this beauty that was destined to be wasted. She wanted to cry as she laughed. This beauty, after all, would soon be wasted. Her young body's rebellion would always confront her, taunting her, reminding her of what could have been, as it decayed in vain. Oh, how mistaken I was. I need love. If I cannot love, I will die. But how can I love? Isn't love now forbidden, impossible for me? Ibrahim was sent away to boarding school. Gozi was heartbroken at her brother's departure, and at night, seeing his empty bed made her cry. She blamed Amina.